It was a Tuesday morning, which I remember because I always go to Hargrove's Diner on Tuesdays. I've been doing that for 11 years, ever since my wife passed. Same corner booth, same cup of black coffee, same laminated menu I never actually read anymore. The waitress, a kind woman named Peggy who has 3 grandkids and a soft spot for old men eating alone, always brings me a slice of apple pie without my asking. I was sitting there with a photograph face up on the table beside my coffee mug. I do that sometimes. I take it out of my wallet and set it down like he's eating breakfast with me. My son, taken from our front yard in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a Saturday afternoon in September of 1989. He was 4 years old. His name was Eli. The photo is the last one we ever took of him. He's sitting on the porch steps in a red striped shirt, squinting into the sun, holding a plastic dinosaur in both hands. He had this habit of gripping things too tight. Even as a toddler, he held on to things like he was afraid they'd float away. I don't know what made me look up. Some instinct, maybe. The diner was filling in with a morning crowd, and I heard the booth behind me scrape against the floor, and I turned slightly without thinking. A man was sitting down across from me. Not in the booth behind me, across from me, in my booth. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair going grey at the temples. A jaw that needed shaving. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, and he had the look of someone who drove a long way to be somewhere and wasn't sure yet if coming was the right call. I said, "Son, I think you've got the wrong table." He didn't move. He looked at the photograph. Then he said, "Is that Eli?" The diner kept moving around us. Peggy called out an order number. Someone laughed near the window, but I couldn't hear any of it right. The world got very small and very still, the way it does when something is about to change everything. I said, "How do you know that name?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the table. A wallet-sized school photo, the kind with the mottled blue background that every elementary school in America uses. The boy in it was maybe 7 or 8, dark-haired, wearing a collared shirt, and he was holding a plastic dinosaur. I couldn't breathe. "I've been carrying that for a long time," he said. "I didn't know what it meant until about 3 years ago." His name was the one he'd been given by the people who took him. He went by it his whole life. But the name his mother and I chose, the name on his birth certificate, the name I whispered to him every night when I put him to bed, that was Eli. Eli James Carver. And the man sitting across from me in Hargrove's Diner was looking at me the way a person looks when they're carrying something so heavy for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. I need to back up, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand what the years between 1989 and now actually looked like for me. My wife, her name was Roberta. Everyone called her Bet. She was a school teacher, 3rd grade, the kind of woman who remembered every student she ever had and could tell you where they ended up. She used to say that children leave marks on you whether they mean to or not. After Eli disappeared, she said that all the time. It became something she repeated when she couldn't find other words. We were not rich people. I worked for the parish utility department. Bet taught school. We owned a small house on a block where everybody knew everybody, and we thought that was safety enough. We thought a neighborhood was a kind of armor. The investigation went on for 2 years. The FBI came in. There were leads that turned into nothing. There was a man seen in a truck near our street who was questioned and released. There was a woman in Shreveport who called a tip line claiming she'd seen a boy matching Eli's description, and I drove there myself, 4 hours, in the middle of the night, and it was nothing. It was always nothing. Bet never stopped hoping. I think that was both the best and the worst thing about her. She kept his room exactly as it was. She kept buying his size in clothes for years, folding them and putting them in the closet. She wrote letters to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children every single year on his birthday. She never, not once, allowed the word dead to be used in our house in reference to him. She died in 2019. Ovarian cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand and she made me promise that if I ever found out what happened to Eli, I would tell her somehow. I don't know exactly what she meant by that, but I promised, and I'm a man who keeps his word even when it costs him. After she died, I kept going. I don't know a better way to say it than that. I kept going. I ate at Hargrove's on Tuesdays. I took my walks. I went to my grandson's baseball games and my daughter's house for Sunday dinners, and I sat with the photographs sometimes, and I kept going. The man in my booth told me his story slowly, with long pauses, like someone reading from pages they'd memorized but were still scared to say aloud. He'd been raised in western Tennessee on a piece of land outside a town called Parsons. The couple who raised him, he called them his parents, right? Up until the moment he discovered they weren't. Had told him he was adopted at birth, that his biological mother was a teenage girl who couldn't afford to keep him. They had paperwork, they had a story, they had a whole life built around it. He said the man he called his father, a man named Cutter, was not a good man. I'm leaving out the details because they are not mine to tell. But I'll say that the boy who became this man sitting across from me grew up hard and learned early that the world was not arranged in his favor. He worked. He got himself out. He built something like a normal life, a trade, a small contracting business. A woman he eventually married. It was his wife who started asking questions. She's the one who noticed, he said. He looked down at his coffee mug, which Peggy had brought over without being asked. She said my eyes didn't match anyone on either side of what I thought was my family. She said it like a joke at first. Just a joke. But she kept at it, the way people do when something won't leave them alone. She found a consumer DNA testing site, the kind you mail a kit to, and she ordered it for both of them as a birthday gift, she said, so they could look up their ancestry together. She thought it would be fun. His results came back with no matches on his supposed father's side. Not one. And on his supposed mother's side, the matches were so distant they were essentially strangers. He didn't do anything with that for almost a year. He said he put the results in a drawer and didn't open the drawer. He understood what it meant, and he chose not to understand it. That's something I recognized. I'd done the same thing, in other ways, over the years. It was a true crime podcast that broke him open. Not a famous one. A small one, run by a woman in Ohio who covered cold cases from the 80s and 90s. She did an episode on child disappearances in Louisiana in 1989, and one of the cases she mentioned was Eli James Carver, 4 years old, Baton Rouge. She described the red-striped shirt. She described the plastic dinosaur. She said the parents never gave up searching. He was driving home from a job site when he heard it. He had to pull over. I sat in my truck for about 45 minutes, he told me. Just sat there. He went home and told his wife. She cried before he even finished the sentence. She was the one who went back to the DNA results. She was the one who found a second cousin match on one of the uploaded family trees. Someone with the last name Carver, from Louisiana. She was the one who found me. I want to tell you that I handled this well. I want to say I was calm and measured, and that I asked all the right questions in the right order. But sitting here telling you the truth, the way I've always tried to tell it, I'll admit that when he said, "I think you might be my father," I had to put both hands flat on the table to keep from tipping over. Not physically. Something inside me, like a foundation that had been cracking for 35 years, finally gave. I asked him what he remembered. He said not much. Flashes. The smell of something he thought might be a magnolia tree, a sound like a screen door, a dog. He said he'd had a recurring dream his whole life of a dog lying on a concrete step, and for his entire childhood he'd thought it was just a dream, and when he heard the podcast describe a yellow Labrador named Cooper who was found tied to the fence post in the Carver family's front yard on the day Eli disappeared, he stopped the truck. We had a dog named Cooper, a yellow lab. I haven't let myself say that name out loud in years. I asked him about the school photo, the one he'd set on the table. He said it was in a box of things that the man who raised him had kept in a storage unit outside of Parsons. When the man died, my son had gone through the storage unit and found the box. Inside was the photo, a woman's bracelet, and a folded newspaper clipping. The clipping was from the Baton Rouge Advocate. September 1989. Missing child. With a photo of Eli in that red-striped shirt. The man who took my son had kept the proof. I don't know why people like that keep proof. Maybe they think they'll never get caught. Maybe they keep trophies the way other men keep fishing photos. Whatever the reason, it meant that my son had sat with that box for a long time, alone, trying to figure out if the child in the newspaper was himself. He looked at me across that table and he said, "I'm pretty sure it's me. But I need you to tell me I'm not wrong." I told him he wasn't wrong. What followed was not a movie. I want to be clear about that because when people hear a story like this, they picture a certain scene. The tearful embrace, the orchestra, the healed family walking into the light. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life is DNA tests ordered through a genetic genealogy specialist and lawyers and paperwork, and a period of weeks where you have this knowledge sitting inside you like a stone and you can't act on it yet and you can barely sleep. I called my daughter. She's the one who held me together through most of what came next. She drove down from Nashville the same night I called her, got in her car at 9 in the evening, and was at my house by 3 in the morning. She sat with me at my kitchen table, and we drank coffee, and I told her everything, and she didn't say a word until I was completely done. And then she said, "Dad, we're going to figure this out." She's always been like that, level-headed in a crisis. Bet used to say she got that from me, but I don't believe it. She got it from her mother. The DNA results confirmed it 6 weeks later. The specialist, a woman who works specifically with families of missing persons cases, called me on a Wednesday afternoon. She said the results showed a parent-child relationship with a probability of over 99.9%. She said it in a professional voice, the way you learn to deliver news in a professional voice, so the person on the other end doesn't completely come apart. But I came apart a little anyway, just for a minute. Then I put myself back together and said thank you and hung up the phone. I sat in my kitchen and I talked to Bet. I know that sounds strange. I don't care if it sounds strange. I told her he's alive and he's okay, and he built himself a life despite everything. I told her I promised I'd tell her, and I was telling her. Then I called my son. Here is where I have to be honest with you about something, because this story does not go the direction you might expect, and I think you deserve the full truth. My son. And I am going to call him my son, because that is what he is. Whatever else is also true. My son had grown up in conditions that shaped him in ways I could not undo with a DNA test and a phone call. The man who took him and the woman who helped raise him were not people who instilled good values. He'd been in legal trouble in his 20s, things I won't detail, and he had a relationship with honesty that was more negotiable than I would have liked. I didn't know this right away. I learned it over time. What I knew first was the story. What I knew first was the joy, and it was real joy. I want to be clear. The first time he came to Baton Rouge, the first time I showed him the house where he was born, the first time I showed him photographs of his mother. He stood in my living room, holding a picture of Betty from 1987, and his hands were shaking. Whatever else was true about him, that moment was true. But a few months in, things started to shift. He'd been struggling financially. His contracting business had hit a rough patch. I believed that part because he showed me the books, and the books were honest enough. What he needed, he said, was a bridge loan, just to get through a difficult season. He didn't ask me for a dollar amount right away. He mentioned it once, and then didn't mention it again, which is actually a more sophisticated way to ask than asking directly, because it stays in your head. Then his wife called me. She said she needed to talk to me without my son knowing. She drove to Baton Rouge alone on a Thursday, and we sat in my kitchen, and she told me that the rough patch with the business was not a rough patch. She said there were debts I didn't know about, and decisions he had made that weren't only about bad luck. She said she had found, while organizing their finances, a set of communications between my son and another man, a man she didn't know, that suggested the approach to me had been planned before the DNA test had even been processed, before the results were confirmed. He had already calculated what he might be able to get. She was crying when she told me this. Not dramatically, the quiet kind of crying that happens when someone has been holding something for a long time and they don't want to be holding it anymore. I asked her why she was telling me. She said, "Because you're a good man, and because he's going to take advantage of that. and because I've been watching him make bad choices for 12 years, and I can't watch him make this one. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't gutted. I had spent 35 years carrying the absence of this person, and then 5 months discovering who he actually was, and the two things did not line up the way I needed them to. The boy I had mourned and the man he had become were not the same. That's not his fault, not entirely. You become who you're raised to become, and he was raised by a man who stole children and called it adoption. But understanding something doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. I called a lawyer, a good one my daughter had used when she bought her business. I told him the situation. He helped me understand what my legal obligations were, and, importantly, what they were not. My son had no legal claim to anything of mine, not on the basis of biology alone, not without a will or a deliberate transfer of assets. What he was counting on was sentiment. He was counting on the fact that I loved him too much to look clearly. He was right that I loved him. He was wrong about what that meant. I called my son and I asked him to come to Baton Rouge. He came on a Saturday. My daughter was there. I had asked her to be there as a witness, and because I did not want to do this alone, I told him what I knew. I told him that his wife had come to me and what she had said, and that I had verified enough of it on my own to believe her. I told him I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened, and I wasn't going to let it go unacknowledged, because that is not how I live my life, and it's not how I raised my daughter, and it's not what his mother would have wanted. He denied it at first. That lasted about. My daughter has a look she gives people when she knows they're lying, a very calm, very steady look that does not move, and she gave him that look, and after 4 minutes he stopped denying it. What came next surprised me. He broke. Not in a manipulative way. I've been around enough people by now to know the difference between someone breaking to get what they want and someone breaking because they've hit something real. He put his face in his hands and he sat like that for a while, and what he said when he looked up was not what I expected. He said, "I don't know how to do this." He meant being a son, being in a family, being in a room with people who were going to be honest with him and not hurt him for it. He meant all of that. He said, "The only family I ever knew, everything was a transaction. You gave to get something back. I don't know what you do when someone just gives." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I am not a saint. I want to be honest about that. There were weeks after that conversation when I was angry, properly angry, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move. He had tried to use my grief as leverage. That is not a thing you forgive in an afternoon. But here is also what is true. He did not take anything from me. His wife stopped it before it got that far. And my son, complicated, damaged, honestly trying in his own imperfect way, called me 6 weeks later and said he'd started seeing a therapist and that his wife had agreed to stay and that he didn't expect me to trust him yet, but he wanted me to know he was trying. I asked him what he was trying toward. He said, "I don't know. Something better than what I've been." That's not nothing. At 63 years old, I have seen enough of the world to know that most people never say that out loud, let alone mean it. I think about Bet a lot during this last part of the story. I think about what she would have said. She was not a naive woman. She taught 3rd grade for 31 years. She knew exactly what people were capable of. But she also had this quality of believing that knowing the truth about someone was not the same thing as giving up on them. She used to say that to me about her students. She'd say, "I can see exactly who he is right now and still believe he can be something else later." I used to think that was just a teacher thing. Now I'm not so sure. I have not given my son money. I want to be clear about that. I am not the kind of man who rewards people for trying to deceive me, and I think handing him a check right now would be the wrong kind of help. But I have spoken to my lawyer about revising my will in a way that's structured and protected. Because whatever he did, whatever he tried to do, I also spent 35 years with a hole in my chest, the exact shape of that boy. And he is here now, and he is trying, and I am not going to pretend that doesn't count for something. My daughter is cautious. She has the right to be cautious. She loves me, and she is protecting me, and I respect every bit of that. We have agreed to take it slowly. My son visits once a month. We eat at Hargrove's on Tuesdays sometimes when he's in town. Peggy brings the apple pie without being asked, and she has learned that on some Tuesdays there are two of us now, so she brings 2 slices. I showed him a photograph of his mother last October. Not the box, not all at once, just one photograph. Bet in 1985, the year before Eli was born, standing in the backyard of the house in a yellow dress, laughing at something off camera. He held it for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I keep my promise to her the only way I know how. I told her I'd tell her if I found him. I tell her in small ways, in the quiet of the kitchen in the morning, in the way I set 2 coffee mugs out some days instead of 1. I don't know if that counts. I think maybe it does. He was 4 years old when they took him, holding a plastic dinosaur in both hands, squinting into the Louisiana sun. He's here now. That's not the ending I imagined, but it's the one I've got, and I'm old enough to know that sometimes the ending you've got is better than nothing, and sometimes it's enough.